So, in this last video on Heidegger's being towards death, we're going to try to unpack what is, I think, probably the most interesting part of his argument regarding existentialism and death. And I think it's worth just mentioning, maybe as a footnote, of course, that the whole concept and discussion of death enters into the equation here because what Heidegger is offering in Being in Time is an argument that there's a more primordial or more basic, if you prefer, way that we exist than the typical way in which we think of ourselves, subject and object, nature and nurture, and all that sort of thing. For Heidegger, our most basic way, our most primordial way of existing is that of being in the world. Now, being in the world kind of implies the reality of death, doesn't it? Because it kind of sets out the boundary of the horizon of all the possibilities that we have in life. So, so let's take a look and see. He has some interesting things to say about how one comports oneself in an authentic way towards death. Um, just we're picking up a little bit from part two on page 308 in Macquarie. He writes, Dasein is authentically itself only to the extent that, as concernful being alongside and solicitous being with, that's kind of like the they self that he kind of unpacked for us earlier, it projects itself upon its own most potentiality for being rather than upon the possibility of the they self. Okay, so there's a way in which we can be that we're not in the crowd, that we're individuated in a meaningful way. And he goes on, at least Macquarie does, to use the word liberated. Further down, one is liberated in such a way that for the first time, one can authentically understand and choose among the factual possibilities lying ahead of that possibility which is not to be outstripped. Of course, that possibility being death itself. And he introduces the word anticipation, which is going to turn out to be pretty pivotal here. Anticipation discloses the existence that its uttermost possibility lies in giving itself up, and thus it shatters all one's tenaciousness to whatever existence one has reached. So, interesting choice of words by Macquarie there. Tenaciousness, the attempt to hold on to things, to make ourselves, as Sartre would later say, a thing, and to have this kind of solidity that things have. We're saying that, look, this anticipation of our death loosens as Tennyson would say, the surly bonds of earth. And now we're, in his words, liberated to see what lies ahead for us. And so, once again, anticipation brings that. The next page writes, since anticipation of the possibility which is not to be outstripped discloses, another key word, all the possibilities which lie ahead of that possibility, this anticipation includes the possibility of taking the whole of Dasein in advance in an existential manner. That is to say, it includes the possibility of existing as a whole potentiality for being. Now, we had already uh, uh, kind of been down this road earlier in Western philosophy in the writings of St. Augustine. St. Augustine, um, in discussing the idea of conversio, when we turn our head and see the ultimate reality, which for him is God, that gives us a sense of totality as fallen man. And I guess Heidegger would say we're fallen when we're in the they self. We're distended. We're out there. We're like so many fragments in a field. But when we anticipate, when we come to a project, when we seize our existence, when we have conversio, when we see and act, we gather ourselves into a totality, and we're not fragmented again. Okay, so this is the liberation that Heidegger talks about here. To maintain oneself in this truth that is, to be certain of what has been disclosed, demands all the more that we should anticipate. So we shouldn't run away from death, from the thinking about death and all that sort of thing. We should um, not see it as a useful tool, as the great religious teacher Saint Francis of Assisi did, refer to death as a kind of assistant, like a brother. That, and why? Why would something so horrible be a brother? Well, because it clarifies our life. Um, Now, of course, we'll see if this argument holds water as we go forward, but this is kind of what he's arguing. Um, Dasein itself, which I myself am, and which as a potentiality for being, I can be myself authentically only by anticipation. In anticipating the indefinite certainty of death, Dasein opens itself to a constant threat arising out of its own out of its own existence. Um, Dasein's mood is the vehicle for bringing this about. Dasein's mood brings us face to face with this almost possibility of impossibility. So there's a mood involved here. And we've met this earlier, okay, in the writings of Kierkegaard and other great uh, religious writers, poets, of course, too, uh, tracing to antiquity that, this clarifies our thinking and opens us up to new possibilities. Um, all understanding, Heidegger writes, is accompanied by a state of mind. Dasein's mood brings it face to face with the thrownness of that it is there. Okay, it's we exist. We live before we understand our existence, right? That's one of the great lessons of the philosopher Hegel. The owl of Minerva only takes flight at dusk. And so our day, we go through our day, we don't really grasp what it is that we've gone through in the day until we have some downtime. We can kind of look back on it and process it and see what's been going on. And so the same thing is true here. It gives us an opportunity to recognize that, okay, look, all of these things that I think are important, all this busy work that I'm involved with, or just regular stuff. That's not perhaps the most important thing. It might be, but is it coming from a place of this is how I want to do my life? Anticipation, Heidegger writes further down, utterly individualizes Dasein and allows it in this individualization of itself to become certain of the totality of its potentiality for being. So I want to zero in on this individualizing of death. And Simon Krejci from the New School makes an excellent point in his discussion of this passage that it's not really certain, or there's some debate about the fact whether being towards death isn't actually an individual thing. I'm paraphrasing very liberally here, but that the death of a person, or the fear of the death of a person, it doesn't necessarily lead to only individual authenticity, but those who are around, also see this. Though, because we care about people, we love them, we share an existence with them. So to say that it is completely individuated is kind of an abstraction to a certain extent. And then Heidegger very helpfully on 311 says we may now summarize our characterization of authentic being towards death. Anticipation, the key word here in this section, reveals to Dasein its lostness in the day self. Okay, so with anticipation, I realize I'm not what I am in the crowd, and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself for the first time, a totality, primarily unsupported by concernful solicitude. That's, kind of busy work phraseology, that sort of way that we are in the world, but of being itself, rather in an impassioned freedom towards death, a freedom which has been released from the illusions of the they, the they self, and which is factual, certain of itself, and anxious. Okay, so all of these, the anxiety of life is kind of baked into the project. It's not, now I'm not talking about serious anxiety or anything, attacks and that sort of thing. But what Heidegger is saying here is that this makes us anxious because we are aware now of our finitude, and things are, time is of the essence, really. So let's just talk a little bit now about some of the critical remarks regarding Heidegger's being towards death. I mentioned earlier that Jean-Paul Sartre didn't find this very persuasive. Sartre kind of saw death as just an absolute horror, something that should be, you know, not glorified or guilted in any way. It doesn't bring anything positive to an individual. Others, Camus and as I said, Simon Cratchy touches on this too. Talk about the death of the loved one, the child, in Camus' The Plague, has a cataclysmic effect on the two main characters, the priest and the doctor in that play, and it changes their whole life, subsequent to that. So, so there is that critique. But I want to go back to this one word in Heidegger's argument that I think is interesting, that death individualizes Dasein. And I think there's room here for maybe a more historical reading of this. Is Are we guilty of uh, kind of setting up an abstract individual? Maybe perhaps part of our sort of bourgeois obsession with individualism generally, where we tend to see, well, you come into the world alone and you leave this world alone. Is that really true? I mean, we weren't fully formed and come into the room on our own. Parents, moms, bring us into the world, and we were brought into a specific world, as Heidegger says himself elsewhere. And so there's this communal aspect to life and death that I think doesn't show up in Heidegger's work. And I think death is a communal experience. Most of us can remember, in my generation anyway, where we were when Dr. King was assassinated, and where we were, what we were doing when JFK was assassinated. And so that was a national mourning. I can still see the coffin and the horse-drawn carriage and all the rest. And so that was deeply traumatic. It did change the culture also, after certainly the death of Dr. King did. So we go through this, and the person who dies, let's unpack that also. They're not part of this discussion, except in the sense in which we think about them, we continue to think about them, we memorialize them, and they continue to exercise a kind of agency. It's not a full agency, full existence, of course, but to say that they're not here that's not really accurate. They're part of the community, they're part of the Wollen Wolf. Now you might say, well, what about individuals who didn't have any kind of a footprint on the culture, the society, and what have you? There too, I think it does also raise the question of uh, community as well. Even an anonymous notice in a local paper about someone who was found, dead, and then no one, no family to contact. Right? That in itself has a kind of shadow on the living, and people have to think about it and what have you. So for me, I think the unspoken questions that come out of Heidegger's analysis of death, and death generally as a philosophical issue, is the inadequacy of the individualizing of the discussion. Um, it Does it need to be more universally grounded, the discussion about death per se, and then is it the most profound question about life? I think it comes back again to an early dialogue of Plato's, the Parmenides, in which Plato and an older Parmenides are discussing the possibility of the idea of a one. Is there a one, namely the God of philosophy, a one, as Aristotle said, that exists over and against the multiplicity of the many, of things? Um, and I think until we actually think through the question of the existence of God, the question of the existence of the one, um, if you prefer, I think the philosophical understanding of death as in a comprehensive philosophical way, uh, is missing, because if God exists, that's a major component of the nature of regarding the nature of reality itself. Uh, and reality is the context for the discussion of death. So, which, of course, is not to say that we haven't had many discussions about death in the history of humanity. But, you know, just to be a little more strict about this, those discussions are invariably discussions about the history of religion. What Plato was insisting on, Aristotle too, is that the question of the existence of the one is a philosophical question in and of itself, separate from religion, which is, maybe the residue of the existence of God or something else. But until we fully unpack the question of the existence of God, I don't know that we can really have a complete discussion about the existence, or the meaning of death. So thank you very much. This will be the last section on what initially appears as a very depressing topic, the topic of death. But like all philosophy, it's an invitation to think things through, to think deeply, and that has, in the argument of philosophers in the tradition, an intrinsic value. So for now, ciao.